Okay, so coughing fit averted. So I left off saying that first and foremost, about 89% of the population of Iran is identifies as Shiite. That is, they practice a form of Shia Islam. In particular, this is a 12er form. We'll talk about what that means later on. But they practice Shia Islam, which is distinct from Sunni Islam. They also, about 58% of the overall population in Iran speak Farsi as their mother tongue. That is their primary language. But 90% of the overall population speak Farsi as a second or third or, even a fourth language. Generally speaking, most people in Iran are literate, looking at about 83%. It shouldn't surprise you that the literacy rate is lower among women. It is lower in tribal areas. It is lower in rural areas, and that kind of plays on top of like the who speaks Farsi as their mother tongue or not. Iran is actually really diverse in terms of its ethnic breakdown. It's a little bit hard for you to see in this particular image. Let me see. Can I zoom in? Nope, of course not. But if you kind of really look here, this is a breakdown of religions in Iran. And what you can see is that 89% of the population, like I said, identify as Shiite. 9% of the population identify as Sunni. And then 2% of the population in Iran identify as either Zoroastrian, Jewish, Christian, or Baha'i. Now, to be perfectly clear about that, Iran has a really dismal record with regards to religious tolerance, and there's outright religious persecution, particularly amongst groups of people who are, say, like Baha'i. There are very small Jewish communities in Iran. They're very tightly controlled by the government. It's not great. So there aren't a whole lot of tolerated faiths aside from Shia Islam. Now, in terms of ethnic groups, this is where things get a little bit more complicated. About 51% identify primarily as Persian in terms of their ethnicity, but there are so many other ethnicities within Iran itself. First and foremost, you have Azeri people. Azeri people are from Azerbaijan. They're largely tribal, historically nomadic. They live up in the northwest of the country. Near the Azerbaijan border. And their language is distinctly more connected to like Georgian and other Caucasus languages than it is to, say, Farsi. Then you have a number of people who speak, who identify as Gilaki, and I'm not going to even try the other one. I will figure, let's see here, I can try it. Mazandarani. And again, those are tribal groups, largely up in the mountainous regions. You have Kurdish populations near the Turkish border, a small sliver of Arab people, mostly along the Iraqi border. Lur, Balok, and Turkmenistan, people from Turkmenistan also make up minority groups within Iran. So these people have different linguistic traditions, different cultural traditions, and often this is where you're going to see any religious diversity that exists in Iran is going to be in those populations. So, as you might imagine, the languages follow as such. About 58% identify Farsi or Farsi-related languages and dialects as their primary mother tongue. About 26% of people speak Turkic languages, everything from Turkmen to Turkish to Kurdish. Those are all Turkic-related languages as their mother tongue. About 9%, I guess they're counting Kurdish here as a separate group. Yeah, that makes sense for political reasons. The Kurdish make up about 9% in terms of their mother tongue, and then you've got about 7% of people who speak some other language as their primary language. Most people in Iran are at least bilingual. They speak at least 2 languages. That's really not uncommon in most countries. The US is the exception, not the rule, with regards to our monolinguistic sort of tradition. Other things to consider with regards to demographics, this data is a little bit out of date. My apologies for that. It's from 2012. But if you look at this data from 2012, what you can see is that you have very much a developing nation sort of curve going on here with a lot of young people. and not a whole lot of people north of about 75, right? There's not a very clear difference between men and women, slightly more on the female side, but there are political reasons for that. There are wars that occur. And what you can also see is that there seems to have been some sort of like fall off here in birth rates. So, a couple of things. Iran has a really young population, and it's very, very large. About 24% of all of Iranians are under 15, and ignore the 27% there. 27 is the median age of people in Iran. So they skew young. Their population skews young, which means that they have a very large workforce right now, and growing, and that eventually you're going to have that large group of people move up through the age ladder. Now, immediately after the revolution in 1979, the Islamic Republic's government pushed to encourage more births. Part of this was because Iran was at war with Iraq and it was bloody. They were losing a huge number of people. And so what they wanted essentially was to like replace those that they were losing so that they would have, well, more soldiers, but also so that they would have more economic strength going forward. So as the war continued, however, the government found itself in economic strait. So when the war finally ended, in the middle of the 1980s, the Iranian government came forth and said, hey, nope, wait, have fewer children right now because we can't afford schooling and supplies and all sorts of stuff for all of these children. That period of economic contraction had started to relent, especially during the latter portion of the Obama administration. Iran's economy was starting to open up a little bit more to the world. There was some optimism that they might be involved in more international trade, and as a result, their population started to grow again. However, in the past 3.5 years, the political situation between the US and Iran has deteriorated, and more sanctions have been placed on Iran, thus causing their economy to go into a tailspin. When you add that into a global pandemic, it probably doesn't bode very well for their birth rate right now. So this is kind of in flux. We could see some interesting things occur with regards to their demography. If we wanted to compare against, say, Iran and the UK and just kind of get a sense of where it is in terms of development, you can see you almost have the kind of that vertical barrel shape with the UK, whereas in Iran, what you can see is the distinct intervention of the state in terms of that out and then back in sort of shape. Actually, if you compare Iran to China with regards to their like population control measures, this is something that is a good point of comparison, very similar in terms of strong government policy with regards to birth rates. Now, I am not going to talk you all the way through the Sunni-Shia split here. What I am going to do, however, is show you this chart, and you can hit pause and like read through it. The one key bit that you really ought to know is that hopefully you know that the split is ultimately down to leadership succession after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And Shia supporters supported Ali and Hussein to become the next caliph after the death of the Prophet, whereas Sunnis followed Abu Bakr. That's kind of the root of the whole thing. However, there are also differences in the form of Shia Islam that is largely practiced in Iran. This is something called Twelver Islam. In Twelver Islam, the notion is that leadership of the Ummah, the faithful, the community of Muslims, should be based on those who can claim lineage to the Prophet, yeah? However, the idea here is that the leaders of the faithful, the imams, there will be 12 true imams. They're not prophets because Muhammad was the last one, but they're sort of like the shepherds of the faith. And the idea is that there have been 11 that have been truly identified, and the 12th will herald about the beginning of the end of the world. And so until that 12th imam makes themselves known, then it is up to Shiite clerics to kind of shepherd the people on the correct path until this 12th imam makes himself known. Okay, that is the broad shape of it. I don't want to like totally screw it up, but that's broadly the notion of it. I do have a little video that I'm going to encourage you to watch about the Sunni Shia split that kind of gets into the modern politics of it. Now, okay, now we actually get into the history of Iran. And I am going to go a little bit over our half-hour limit here, but not by a huge amount, I promise. Okay, so as I mentioned, Persia was located as a crossing grounds. It was a place where you saw a lot of migrations. But the first migration of humans that into this region that we can prove through archaeological and other means, mitochondrial DNA drift, all sorts of stuff like that. We know that people from Central Asia migrated into Persia by at least 2000 BCE. So there's been continuous human occupation of Persia for about, at this point, we are talking about 4,000 odd years, probably longer than that. But it really wasn't until about 550 BCE that you started to see cohesive political units develop in this region. Prior to 550 BCE, you had small villages, small principalities, some small kingdoms scattered throughout the Persian regions. But the fact of the difficulty of the terrain, the lack of arable land, all sorts of stuff like that, really made this territory difficult to pull together into one cohesive territory. At least until Cyrus the Great. So Cyrus the Great was of the Achaemenid line. He is going to establish the Achaemenid dynasty, which rules this area for about 200 years. So Cyrus the Great is a pretty cool dude. He is a conqueror. He's a military guy. He takes over territory by force. But there's a lot of cool stuff he does. Number one, he pays his soldiers in actual coin, and he pays them before they go to war. What this means is that when Cyrus conquers kingdoms all throughout Persia, his soldiers don't pillage the kingdoms and lands that they conquer. And if they do, he has them executed. What this meant was that Cyrus was seen actually as kind of a cool dude to be conquered by. First of all, he didn't actually care to remove people from power when he conquered your territory. He just wanted you to pay taxes up the way, and you were allowed to keep your local rules, your local traditions, and so long as you kind of acknowledged him as your supreme leader, your king of kings, this is where that title comes from. In Persian, it's Shah in Shah. He was cool with leaving other people in power. He also developed a large-scale road system. Now, it's not exactly like the Romans, it's not paved, it's still dirt, but it is a road system that allows his military to move quickly and efficiently, and it also secures trade. He also had a reputation for being pretty cool when he conquered territories because he would liberate enslaved people wherever he found them. And this is because Cyrus was a Zoroastrian, which is the next little bit here. So if you are not familiar with Zoroastrianism, Zoroastrianism is one of the earliest forms of monotheism that we find. It is a major symbol of Persian identity today. It is not related directly to Judeo-Christian and Islamic traditions. However, some populations of Jewish people had been enslaved in Babylon, which of course is in the Tigris and Euphrates, in between the Tigris and Euphrates in what is today Iraq. When Cyrus conquered that territory, he liberated the Jewish population there, and they brought some Zoroastrian traditions back with them to Judea and to other areas, and thus these ideas make their way into Christian and Islamic tradition as well. So, in Zoroastrianism, the great god out there, Ahura Mazda, the god that is the force for good, is ultimately going to go to battle on Earth with the forces of evil. It will be an actual physical battle, and at the end of everything, those who side with Ahura Mazda will be resurrected from their deaths, and those who do not will be, like, damned. Which should sound pretty familiar if you know your book of Revelations, right? So, like, Zoroastrianism has some influence here, even though theologically it's not directly related to Judaism or Christianity. Ultimately, this area is going to collapse due to the conquest by Alexander the Great. Alexander has kind of a desire to conquer Persia as a result of the Greek and Persian wars. I'm going to pause here and then we'll finish up in just a couple of minutes.